Nonverbal Communication by Emily Anderson, Cassie Dasco, and Katie McNabb. Today we will be discussing why Cornerstone University should offer nonverbal communication classes in preparation for short-term cross-cultural trips.
Here we have a short but humorous clip from I Love Lucy just introducing verbal communication, nonverbal communication.
She said she wouldn't say a word, just her lips are sealed.
Huh? Oh, boy, I'll say they're sealed.
Hey, I kind of like that. How come you never went in for one of those?
Oh, shut up. Lucy, Ricky says you know a nice piece of juicy gossip. Well, tell me. Oh, darn it.
This is liable to be real good, Fred. Will you get to join me in a ringside seat? Thank you.
Oh, this is maddening. Who's it about, Lucy? Madge? Glenn? Dorothy? Claire? Betty? It's about Betty? Betty and who? Betty and Fred? No. Betty and Ricky? Oh. Betty and her husband Jack. Oh, Betty and her husband Jack. What happened? They had a fight? What'd they fight about? A date? A woman? Another woman? Oh! Betty and her husband Jack had a fight about another woman? Oh!
Lucy, promise you weren't going to say anything to Ethel about it. You're breaking your promise. I don't care if you're not saying anything. You're still gossiping.
Don't stop her now. I haven't found out what happened.
Although this is a short and almost unrelated clip, it shows how nonverbals can really get a point across even when we're not using words.
There are many advantages to nonverbal communication. They complement a conversation by adding meaning that can't be added through words, more easily present information and attributes, and they help travelers cross the language barriers, which would be most helpful during these short mission trips. You can accent important points in a conversation using hand gestures, and they help relay messages in situations where it might be too loud to say it verbally, and it reduces the time it takes to relay messages to other people around you.
There were two main studies that we looked into concerning the nonverbal communication. The first one is called Training Soldiers to Decode Nonverbal Cues in Cross-Cultural Interactions, and the second is in Communication and Social Interaction. The first one that we'll talk about is the study by Rosenthal.
In a study conducted by the United States Army Research Institute, the purpose of nonverbal communication training was assessed. According to this study, nonverbal cues contain a wealth of information about the emotion of individuals, power distribution, what someone's thinking, and generally what's going on. For deployments, the military requires language and cultural orientation for the country that they're traveling to. This nonverbal training tends to be generic when the culture's evolvement over the years is taken into account, but a foundational amount of knowledge is required for these deployments. Before deployments, U.S. soldiers must also learn cultural do's and don'ts. A cultural do is smiling, because smiles are rarely misunderstood across cultures, but using your left hand to do things is not all right in a lot of cultures. It's good to avoid stretching your legs in front of or sitting up higher than others, sitting with your left hand behind your back, or positioning oneself so that the shadows fall upon half of one's body. You should not allow the soles of your feet to be showing, as they are the lowest and dirtiest part of the body. You should not stare at women, and you should not shake their hand unless they first extend it to you. You should also avoid gestures such as a thumbs up or peace signs. Specialized programs are used during these training periods that will target different cultures or customs. These training procedures range anywhere from written tests to role-playing opposite an actor.
The second study that we looked into was the study by Ekman. It is important to recognize how those in other cultures are feeling, which seems to be a given, but sometimes it's not understood. It needs to be recognized if there are feelings of being offended or feelings of friendliness, and this is something that we often need to be trained to recognize if it's not said straight out loud. For example, in other countries, individuals show their love or anger in different ways. In Uganda, if asked a question, Ugandans will raise their eyebrows to signal yes, but if that's unclear that it means yes, it can easily be taken as hostility and one can feel ignored. The study also shows that people communicate most effectively in their own culture, which is clear. Therefore, it is important to understand the other cultures and how they interact with each other. Whether it's learning in-depth cultural practices concerning the location of travel or learning the general nonverbal cues and micro-expressions that are the same across the board, any training is better than no training when it comes to crossing these cultural barriers. Also, it is difficult to be immersed in a culture and understand the norms when only traveling for a short term. Training will help students get the most out of their experience abroad and truly be able to relate to the culture they're exploring, even if they're not there for a long period of time. Cultural gaps also represent miscommunication. If abroad and interacting with people in other cultures, the ignorance of us as Americans often pushes people away and creates even more of a gap between peoples. With training, these gaps will be able to be closed and even avoided. We are not communicating as effectively as possible if we are not understanding the nonverbal communication that happens in and out of conversation. These studies show we have learned that nonverbals are the same across the board. They are simple enough to be educated in, and there's truly no reason that Cornerstone isn't requiring light classes for all students, not even necessarily those just studying abroad. Nevertheless, classes would be very important when planning to travel.
Nick Anderson, a corporal in the United States Marine Corps, shared with us his personal experience regarding a cross-cultural trip and how nonverbal communication proved necessary during his time in Afghanistan. He told us, "We relied heavily on nonverbal communication in Afghanistan. When we weren't on patrol, we used nonverbal communication around base. We worked closely with the Afghan National Army, and so we occasionally had to work past our language barriers. We also encountered a lot of tragedy while we were over there, and on particularly low days, no one ever had to say anything to communicate his mourning or distress. I saw while I was over there that emotions are universal, even though languages may not be. Sometimes it was the things that people didn't say that built the most trust."
We also talked to Jared Heddens, who's an adjunct professor at Cornerstone and is also the worship and mission director at South Harbor Church and Byron Center. This is the group that he traveled to Ethiopia with in April of 2014. He said, "When you greet somebody, you look them in the eye, you speak slowly, and you follow strict physical traditions. When you talk with someone, you always have their full attention. Nothing else matters but you and them in that moment. The conversation lasts as long as it needs to. This can also be a problem when Americans are talking, as the other will politely let you finish your thought. If your thoughts never end, they will patiently wait until it does." He said that the nonverbal training he received before his trip was absolutely essential for his travel, and he thinks it would be good for Americans in general. He said, "Fortunately for me, I had a lot of good training before we left, although I will admit it was super hard to remember to do this all the time." And then conclusion, we believe that training should be given because it helps enhance the experience in a variety of different ways. Being able to understand how other cultures interact with each other will help students understand how to interact. Training will help avoid awkward and offensive situations when interacting with peoples of other cultures. Understanding the base of why people do things the way they do is to help students appreciate the cultures for all their worth, and gives the opportunity to take part in a culture they're not usually immersed in. Training will help students get the most out of their experience abroad, and truly be able to relate to the culture they're exploring. This training would also help those close the cultural gaps, and will help students communicate effectively not only when abroad, but in everyday life.
The end.